The chalk dust hung thick in the lecture hall as Professor Whitmore scrawled another equation across the board. His back turned to the sea of faces before him. Marcus Johnson sat in the back row, his worn notebook open, pen poised, watching not with the glazed-over expression of his classmates, but with an intensity that burned quiet and steady. He'd learned early that certain battles weren't worth fighting. Not yet. Anyway, not when you were the only black student in advanced calculus. Not when your professor had already decided you didn't belong there before you'd solved your first problem. The morning had started like any other at Westbridge University, with Marcus arriving 30 minutes early to claim his spot in the back corner. He preferred it there. Less visible, less vulnerable. His scholarship depended on maintaining perfect grades, and he couldn't afford the distraction of constantly proving himself worthy of occupying space in rooms where people looked at him and saw a mistake in admissions, a diversity checkbox, anything but what he actually was. A young man who'd been solving complex mathematical proofs since he was 12 years old, who saw numbers the way composers heard music, who understood the language of equations better than he understood the language of fitting in. Professor Whitmore turned from the board, his eyes scanning the room with that particular brand of academic arrogance that came from 20 years of tenure and a wall full of degrees. "Now then," he announced, his voice carrying that perpetual undertone of condescension that made Marcus's jaw tighten. "Let's see who actually completed the homework assignment." Hands rose across the lecture hall. Marcus raised his too, though he'd learned his participation rarely received the same acknowledgement as others. Sure enough, Whitmore's gaze skipped over him, landing instead on Jennifer Chen in the third row, then on David Kowalski near the front, calling on them to present their solutions while Marcus's raised hand remained invisible, as if he'd become one with the shadows he sat in. It was during the problem review that everything shifted. Whitmore had been working through a particularly challenging integration problem when his marker squeaked to a halt mid-equation. He'd made an error, a subtle one, but Marcus caught it immediately. The professor continued, building on the mistake, and Marcus watched as the solution spiraled toward an impossible conclusion. He hesitated. Speaking up meant drawing attention, meant risking the professor's irritation, meant potentially being wrong in front of everyone, even though he knew he wasn't. But staying silent meant letting everyone copy down an incorrect solution, meant compromising the integrity of the very thing he loved most. Marcus cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Professor?" The room fell silent. Whitmore turned slowly, his expression already hardening as he located the source of the interruption. "Yes, Mr. Johnson? Do you have a question?" The way he said it implied that questions from Marcus were inherently remedial, a burden on everyone's time. "I think there might be an error. In the third line, the sign should be positive, not negative. When you applied the chain rule..." "Are you suggesting?" Whitmore interrupted, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that professors wielded like weapons. "That I've made a mistake?" The other students shifted in their seats. Marcus could feel their eyes on him. Some sympathetic, others second-hand embarrassed. Many simply uncomfortable with the confrontation brewing before them. "I'm just saying that if we continue with the negative sign, the integral won't converge properly and..." "Mr. Johnson." Whitmore set his marker down with deliberate precision. "I've been teaching mathematics for over 2 decades. Perhaps if you spent less time questioning your betters and more time trying to keep up with the coursework, you'd find yourself less confused." The words landed like acid. Marcus felt his face grow hot, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd had practice at that, too. Around him, he could hear the soft scratching of pens as students dutifully copied down the incorrect solution, not wanting to contradict the professor, not wanting to risk their own standing. That's when Whitmore did something Marcus would never forget. The professor walked to the sideboard, the one reserved for extra difficult problems, and began writing an equation. Not just any equation. Marcus recognized it immediately as a variation of the Riemann hypothesis, one of the most famous unsolved problems in mathematics, modified and twisted into something even more complex. "Tell you what, Mr. Johnson," Whitmore said, his voice dripping with theatrical generosity. "Since you seem to think you know better than everyone else in this room, including your instructor, why don't you come up here and solve this?" He tapped the board. "In fact, I'll make you a deal. If you can solve this equation right here, right now, I'll admit my mistake on the previous problem. But when you can't, I expect an apology to me and to your classmates for wasting everyone's time." The lecture hall was dead silent. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the room. This was a trap, and everyone knew it. The equation on the board wasn't just difficult. It was designed to be impossible. The kind of problem that mathematicians spent years attempting to solve. It was humiliation disguised as opportunity, a public execution dressed up as academic discourse. For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Every instinct screamed at him to stay seated, to apologize, to make himself small and invisible again. That's what was expected. That's what was safe. But then he looked at the equation again, really looked at it, and something clicked into place. The problem was complex, yes, but Whitmore had made an assumption in how he'd structured it, had built it on a foundation that could be circumvented with a different approach. Marcus had seen something similar in a paper he'd read 3 months ago. Research by a Nigerian mathematician that most American academics hadn't bothered to engage with. If he applied that framework, substituted certain variables, approached it from an entirely different angle. He stood up. The walk to the front of the classroom felt eternal. His sneakers squeaked against the linoleum. His hands trembled slightly as he took the chalk from Whitmore's outstretched hand. The professor's smile smug and certain. Marcus turned to the board and began to write. At first, his classmates watched with that mixture of pity and curiosity reserved for witnessing someone's downfall. But as Marcus's chalk flew across the board, as elegant solutions bloomed beneath his hands, as he deconstructed Whitmore's impossible equation with a methodology that was both unorthodox and undeniably brilliant, the energy in the room began to shift. He worked in silence, his mind translating intuition into proof, building bridges across mathematical chasms with a confidence that came from genuine understanding rather than performance. He filled one section of the board, then another, his handwriting rushed but precise, his logic irrefutable. Whitmore's smile had faded. He stepped closer to the board, his eyes scanning Marcus's work with growing disbelief. Other students had pulled out their phones, some recording, others frantically trying to follow the mathematical journey unfolding before them. 15 minutes later, Marcus set down the chalk and stepped back. On the board behind him was not just a solution, but an elegant proof, a thing of beauty that reduced Whitmore's impossible equation to a solvable truth. "The answer is 17.33, repeating," Marcus said quietly. "But the more important finding is in the methodology, the approach you used to construct. The problem assumed a fixed relationship between these variables, but if you allow for dynamic substitution using this framework," he pointed to a section of his proof, "the problem stops being impossible and becomes merely difficult." The silence that followed was different from before. Jennifer Chen started clapping first, then David. Then more students joined in until the entire lecture hall erupted in applause. But Marcus wasn't looking at his classmates. He was looking at Professor Whitmore, whose face had cycled through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been shame. "Where did you learn this approach?" Whitmore asked, his voice barely audible over the applause. "From Dr. Adeyemi's paper on adaptive variable frameworks. It was published in the Journal of Contemporary Mathematics 18 months ago." Marcus paused. "You probably didn't read it." The implication hung in the air that Whitmore, in his academic arrogance, had dismissed research from mathematicians who didn't fit his narrow definition of expertise, had let his biases blind him to brilliance, simply because it came from unexpected places. What happened next surprised everyone, including Marcus. Whitmore walked to the original board, picked up the eraser, and corrected his earlier mistake. "You were right," he said, his voice strained but clear. "The sign should be positive. I apologize for my error and for—" He hesitated, seemed to struggle with the words. "For underestimating you. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't enough. But it was something." After class, as Marcus packed his notebook, Jennifer approached him. "That was incredible. How did you do that?" Marcus shrugged. Uncomfortable with the attention, even as part of him savored the vindication. "Math doesn't care what you look like. It only cares if you're right. Will you help me understand that adaptive framework thing? I want to actually learn it, not just copy it down." Others joined her, forming a small crowd around Marcus's desk, asking questions, requesting study sessions, seeing him, really seeing him, for perhaps the first time all semester. The invisible student in the back row had become impossible to ignore. That evening, Marcus received an email from Professor Whitmore requesting a meeting. He expected confrontation, retaliation, the kind of academic vengeance that powerful men wielded against those who made them look foolish. But when he arrived at Whitmore's office the next day, the professor looked smaller somehow, older. "I checked your records," Whitmore began. "You have perfect scores on every assignment. You should be sitting in the front row, not hiding in the back." "I wasn't hiding," Marcus said quietly. "I was surviving." The words landed like stones. Whitmore flinched. "I let my assumptions blind me to your abilities. That's inexcusable for an educator." "Yes," Marcus agreed, because some truths didn't need softening. "I'd like to recommend you for the department's research assistant position. It comes with a stipend and would look excellent on graduate school applications." Marcus studied the man before him, looking for the catch, the trap, the hidden cost. But all he saw was regret and a tentative offering of amends. It didn't erase the months of being overlooked, didn't undo the casual cruelty of being publicly challenged for sport. But it was a start. "I'll think about it," Marcus said, and he meant it. As he walked across campus that afternoon, Marcus felt something shift inside him. He'd spent so long trying to be small, trying to avoid conflict, trying to survive by being invisible. But maybe there was another way. Maybe brilliance was meant to be seen, was meant to challenge assumptions, was meant to rewrite the rules about who belonged in spaces that had historically excluded people who looked like him. The next class, Marcus sat in the front row,